I'm Josh Hardman, the founder and editor of Psychedelic Alpha, and you're listening to a Field Note, a brief dispatch from the worlds of psychedelic drug development, policy, and access that are usually exclusively for our Psychedelic Alpha Plus subscribers. But this one, our third issue, is being made available for free. Hello, thanks for listening. I'm here in Indiana in the US at what is an incredibly busy time. I said last Sunday in my psychedelic newsfeed introduction that I thought the next week was going to bring lots of news and be very busy, and I advised you all to take some time for yourselves on Sunday ahead of that busy week I saw coming, and I wish I listened to my own advice. This week's been so busy, and also there's this strange thing that seems to happen where news always comes out when I'm on a plane. Luckily, most airplanes these days have pretty good Wi-Fi, but it does make things a little bit more challenging. So a very busy week for us in covering all this news, but that's a wonderful problem to have. So before we start, let's just take a step back and reel off the half dozen or so things that have happened this week, at least the most prominent ones, because there are many others we won't get to. So firstly, the US Food and Drug Administration, FDA, issued its final guidance for clinical investigations of psychedelics. The same agency, the FDA, announced a September psychedelics public hearing and an associated request for comments. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, and the Veteran Affairs Administration, the VA, entered into a memorandum of understanding covering research, clinical development, and potential deployment of psychedelics to veterans. FDA and VA also entered into another memorandum of understanding covering information sharing and scientific collaboration on the topic of psychedelics. NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, part of the National Institutes of Health, awarded funding to a project in the Harvard Health System, and that's focused on ibogaine for opioid use disorder. ARPA-H, the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, also announced a competitive ibogaine for opioid use disorder funding opportunity. HRSA, the Health Resources and Services Administration, put out a request for information pertaining to healthcare infrastructure readiness for the potential approval and rollout of psychedelics. And lastly, what a list. Lastly, Eli Lilly, the world's largest pharmaceutical company by some measures, is set to acquire psychedelic drug developer AtaiBeckley. Take a breath. So we're going to go through some of these. We'll look at the FDA final guidance for clinical investigations of psychedelics. We'll look briefly at the public hearing scheduled for September by FDA. We'll look at that NIDA ibogaine grant. And lastly, we'll explore Eli Lilly's acquisition of AtaiBeckley. So firstly, let's dive into that final guidance from FDA, which basically lays out for sponsors, including academics and companies, the ways that the agency expects them to conduct clinical investigations of psychedelic drugs. Now, 80 days ago, right after the executive order related to psychedelics was signed in April, it was said that the final guidance would be released imminently, and now we have it. That's over 3 years from the draft guidance, which many of you will remember was issued during Psychedelic Science, the enormous conference in Denver where thousands of people from across the psychedelics field came to discuss many different aspects of psychedelics, from drug development through to research and culture. So the final guidance document at least provides some clarity on many things. Many elements of the original draft guidance do remain intact, but there are some changes. We covered these changes on Monday in our write-up, and we will cover them in more detail in a forthcoming bulletin. In the interest of being light on your ears, we won't run through them all. One thing that we do see in the new guidance is the FDA saying that the most informative design in terms of a long-term follow-up, so following patients after the sort of primary endpoint, is a 12-month blinded follow-up with pre-specified retreatment criteria. Now, this is different to the open-label 12-month long-term follow-up envisaged in the draft guidance, and some people told us, they find this very harsh. It is, clear to say that this is sort of the agency's ideal design, maybe not one that it will enforce or even expect from sponsors. But Martin Arns, a TMS practitioner and researcher and entrepreneur, told us that he finds it harsh. He said it's disproportionate to what is realistically feasible. Tanya Ramey, the former chief medical officer of USONA Institute, also told us she has similar views. She called it a difficult, extremely high bar, and suggesting that it's unfair versus programs like esketamines, now Spravato, and others. The final guidance also provided some clarifications on things related to safety. So it said that things like driving studies should be considered. It also tried to clear up questions around adverse events, with some in the field suggesting that things that are sort sort of fundamental to the psychedelic experience, or that might actually be part of the subjective experience itself, aren't adverse events. And there was some sort of dispute around that or discussion around that, especially around the MDMA application from Lykos, now Resilient, a couple of years ago. But the agency really seeking to clarify that pretty much everything needs to be reported, even if it is expected or deemed part of the therapeutic mechanism or so on and so forth. Other elements of the final guidance encourage sponsors not to unnecessarily exclude patients from trials, including, for example, those with certain health characteristics like pregnancy, which some researchers viewed as surprising because they felt that that was a pretty accepted exclusion. Elsewhere on the monitoring side, the final guidance now says that those with a nursing degree and relevant experience can act as an assistant monitor, though not the lead. These are just some of the updates in the final guidance. But when we view these versus the stakeholder feedback that the agency solicited and received, over 200 pieces of feedback back in 2023, which we covered at the time, and that we reanalyze now versus this final guidance, there's a lot left out, a lot that the agency hasn't addressed, or at least hasn't changed in the final guidance. So back then, some stakeholders asked for shorter durability assessments, perhaps 6 months versus the 12-month timeline. That hasn't been the case in some cases, as we've touched upon. Long-term follow-up expectations of the agency may even be more stringent. Some asked for a modification to the number of monitors to patients. Some have also expressed concern as to how or whether the expectations of the agency outlined in the final guidance might inform REMS, so risk evaluation and mitigation strategies elements. So REMS is obviously what we expect psychedelics to be approved alongside, and it sets out various elements to assure the safe use of the drug, which could or surely will include things like who and how many people are involved in the delivery of these medications if approved, and things like minimum monitoring durations. So some of the elements of the final guidance, which is for clinical investigations, are quite vague. So it says there's a lead monitor and an assistant monitor, but it doesn't specify whether they must be in the room at all times. And some people have been concerned here, sort of suggesting the REMS may require that both monitors be in the room at the same time. Now, this is not our interpretation. We think that, vague nature of that part of the guidance is not exactly deliberate, but is open to interpretation and discussion with the agency. And that means that things like having 2 in the room is fine by the agency, but also having 1 in the room and 1 on Zoom, so to speak. So having someone who is monitoring the session live and could intervene on the drop of a dime is also fine with the agency. And obviously we know some sponsors have conducted their trials in that manner. So yeah, we expect that the REMS will be informed both by clinical data generated, but also through discussion between the sponsor and the agency, as opposed to the sort of final guidance on clinical investigations dictating what goes into the REMS in a sort of pro forma way. So probably misplaced concern there. Just lastly, we're also hearing that the FDA may be responding to investigational new drug applications, so applications to commence trials of a given candidate in the psychedelic field, with a kind of 10-point psychedelic IND checklist, which requires sponsors to identify how they're meeting key elements of the guidance and justifying any deviations therefrom. Now, this would be an interesting development. It could also make sense given that at least a third, and probably closer to half of the Division of Psychiatry's workload is made up of psychedelic-related candidates. So it could make sense that they're seeking to sort of streamline or templatize their review of those INDs. But an interesting development there if we do see that replicated across INDs in the field. So next up is the public hearing that FDA also announced on Monday. It's slated for September the 14th, 2026 this year, and it's going to be broadly on the potential future therapeutic use of psychedelic drugs, in the agency's own words, and that's going to take place at the White Oak campus, FDA's campus in Maryland, and also virtually. And the FDA said there's 4 topics it really wants to hear from both of the hearing and its request for comments, which stays open through October, I believe. So those topics are provider training and credentialing, patient safety, access considerations, and best practices around data collection and standardization. Now, the agency's also told us what it doesn't want to hear about. So it's not interested in comments or presentations around the safety and effectiveness of any particular drug product or candidate. It's not interested in entertaining discussions on scheduling of substances or, for that matter, legalization or decriminalization. It's not interested in getting into the weeds on the merits of state or local psychedelic programs, though data collection around those programs is welcomed. It's also not interested in religious, ceremonial, or personal use, or individual disputes, enforcement matters, or complaints that focus on specific practitioners or entities, it says. So it seems clear the agency is looking to host this meeting, which will be attended by other federal representatives, it says, to focus on the potential rollout of psychedelic drugs, including things like safety and access, but it perhaps doesn't want to get bogged down in arguments or disputes or AdCom-style evaluations of particular candidates. So the FDA gave us plenty of news this last week, but NIDA, the National Institute on Drug Abuse, also provided a headline. It's providing up to $11 million in funding to Joji Suzuki and his group at Mass General Brigham Hospital in the Harvard system for a program of studies around ibogaine. Now, the initial goal, which is supported at least for now by $2.3 million in funding, is to secure investigational new drug clearance for ibogaine, which would allow first-in-human studies to commence in the United States, which is a bit of an elusive goal for ibogaine advocates, researchers, and drug developers alike. It's been challenging to get studies started, but Suzuki and his group will hope that they can now have a good run at doing so. The goal is to get that IND cleared, and then, if that's the case, a phase 1 study, and then if the safety data allows, a phase 2A study in opioid use disorder. Now, FDA has already pushed back on the phase 1 design, Suzuki told us, but NIDA, the funding agency, is being flexible, he said. So normally, if you had to adjust your phase 1 design, as it seems is the case here, NIDA could be a bit fussy, given that they funded the phase 1 protocol. But he says they're being very pragmatic, and now it really remains to be seen whether alignment with the agency can be discovered and the IND cleared. It seems dosing could be an issue. We have heard from other ibogaine IND applicants and researchers considering ibogaine INDs that dosing is obviously a hot topic and one of considerable interest among both the applicants and the agency. So this is interesting. Suzuki said that his colleagues in the Harvard system and at the hospitals are generally fine or ambivalent about the research, but he did say that there could be some either pushback or at least disinterest or perhaps even skepticism from those in the field of addiction research and practice. At the moment, GLP-1 drugs are all the rage. I actually met with Suzuki earlier this year at the American Psychiatric Association's annual meeting in San Francisco, and he was delivering an opening talk of sorts on GLP-1s for substance use disorders, and it was a packed room, a real hot topic. So he says providing more data to his colleagues in the field could help with that skepticism. But that was interesting. Another thing that can help with skepticism is, of course, the brand of organizations or institutions like Stanford and now potentially Harvard. Even Trump acknowledged Stanford, of course, in his signing of the executive order around psychedelics back in April, which obviously cited ibogaine by name and no other psychedelic drugs. So even though Trump is in dispute with higher education institutions like Stanford and especially Harvard, it does seem that their brand still carries quite a bit of weight. Now, this effort to get an IND cleared is running alongside other efforts, both from drug developers in the ibogaine world, but also from the Texas Consortium of Research Institutions that's backed by $100 million in funding from the Texas government. So that's nearly 10 times as much as Suzuki and his colleagues at Harvard are lined up for with NIDA. But the Texas model is somewhat convoluted and complicated, whereas Suzuki and co. have a pretty standard NIDA grant, a UG3 grant, and now the goal really is to collaborate with FDA and get a phase 1 trial design in the locker, get all the preclinical work lined up and get the IND cleared. So it'll be interesting to see whether a more simple process, even though accompanied by a very complex drug, can get the job done and get human studies started in the US, which, as we say, has been an elusive goal of researchers, advocates, and drug developers alike. Okay, our last story of sorts is this big one that Eli Lilly, the world's largest pharmaceutical company by some metrics, is set to acquire psychedelic drug developer AtaiBeckley. AtaiBeckley obviously having the lead candidate BPL-003, which is an intranasal formulation of 5-MeO-DMT, the very potent short-acting psychedelic that's being developed for treatment-resistant depression, TRD. Back in March, we covered the fact that AtaiBeckley was engaged in a sort of structured process to look at co-development deals deals or royalty investment deals around BPL-003. And at the time, sources close to the company told us it wasn't considering a total acquisition of the candidate, let alone the company. But last week, we reported in our bulletin that a deal was nearing completion and that a buyout offer was perhaps on the table. And then on Wednesday, Bloomberg reported that Eli Lilly was the potential suitor and that it was looking to take the whole company. Thursday morning, this was confirmed by both AtaiBeckley and Eli Lilly, who announced the terms of the deal. The deal is valued at $2.8 billion in upfront payment plus $1 billion in milestones. That upfront payment, $2.8 billion, is around the IPO value of Atai Life Sciences back in 2021. And that was before it merged with Beckley Psytech. At one point, the company was worth around double that on the public markets. Shareholders still need to endorse the transaction that could happen in the next couple of months. Lilly is guiding that the transaction is expected to close this quarter. Now, on that valuation, some investors are not so happy. They think it's a bit of a modest valuation. Some of them have told us that they don't understand why AtaiBeckley would sell itself for that valuation, given that it has runway through 2029. One could speculate that AtaiBeckley and its board think that now is actually a great time for a sale, with valuations in the field much richer following a series of catalysts in the regulatory sphere in the US and drug development catalysts like Definium Therapeutics LSD phase 3 readouts, which saw that company's share price appreciate substantially. They might also view this as perhaps a local peak in terms of valuations, or as a particularly propitious time to sell the company then, given that momentum. And maybe they're also worried that momentum could fizzle out as commercial launches come to pass, with companies like Compass Pathways and other potential early launching candidates having to build out the groundwork for rollout. I mean, looking back at Spravato, of course, it took Johnson & Johnson quite a while to get that right. So perhaps they view this as the right time to be selling the company, and at this valuation, whilst some investors in the company have complained, others in the field have wondered whether a large pharmaceutical company is the right match for a psychedelic, especially one like 5-MeO-DMT. Now, it is an interesting moment, looking at a company like Eli Lilly, which was obviously the backer of Prozac back in 1987, the first SSRI nearly 40 years ago, ushering in a new era of treatment of conditions like depression, now potentially being on the leading edge of another new era in the treatment of depression and related conditions with psychedelics. So a fascinating time. So now most people involved in the deal are keeping quiet, which is perhaps unsurprising. But I spoke to Cosmo Fielding Mellon, who's the founder of Beckley Psytech, which was obviously acquired by AtaiBeckley, and he described it to me when we spoke on Thursday morning as amazing news and validation for the whole field. Most importantly, he said, it maximizes the chances of BPL-003 and other treatments reaching millions of patients in need. Cosmo also said, it's crazy to think how far we've come since my mother, which is Lady Amanda Fielding, set up the Beckley Foundation, and everyone thought she was mad. So as I say, Cosmo's mother, Amanda Fielding, she founded the Beckley Foundation in the UK, which was a major funder of psychedelic research before the current phase of excitement. She passed away, sadly, last year. But an interesting perspective, and it's true, just to think how far things have come over the last year or two, let alone the last decade or longer. Okay, so let's wrap up. That was a jam-packed field note. I think one way of appreciating just how much has changed or progressed over the last few months, and even this last week, is to fire up your web browser and type in fda.gov. At least at the time of recording, if you head to the FDA's homepage, you'll see a banner that says Advancing Research on Psychedelic Drugs. You click the link and it takes you through to a webpage where FDA is highlighting how it's working to catalyze the research and potential access to psychedelics, which is quite remarkable, and certainly I don't think would be on anyone's bingo card a couple of years ago. Now, another thing that wouldn't have been on those bingo cards was the world's largest pharma company, Eli Lilly, the one that brought the SSRI era upon us, acquiring a psychedelic drug developer. Another remarkable moment. So, wow, what a lot to cover and what a fascinating time. Now, Psychedelic Alpha is excited to be partnering with Horizons to co-host the Psychedelic Business Forum on Thursday, October the 15th at the New York Academy of Medicine. Those of you who know me know that I don't like plugging, I don't like advertising or promoting things, but I'm really excited about this. I think it's an incredibly opportune time to be meeting to discuss the future of psychedelics, including a real focus on potential rollouts and access. And it's happening a month after the FDA's public meeting and right around when new drug applications for these candidates are expected to be handed in to the FDA. So I really feel so fortunate that this is happening at that time on the East Coast of America. I do hope you'll join us. For more information, you can head to horizonsconference.org/Thursday. I do hope to see you there. In the meantime, for those of you who are not already Psychedelic Alpha Plus subscribers, please also consider heading to psychedelicalpha.com/join to learn more about it. Essentially, the long story short is the vast majority of our coverage, both written but also these audio field notes and quarterly briefing videos, are exclusively for our Psychedelic Alpha Plus subscribers. So if you want the latest news, please do consider that. But for now, all that remains is for me to say thank you for listening to this field note. I do hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll join us for the next one. Have a great day. Thanks for listening to this field note. I'm always keen to hear from you, our Psychedelic Alpha Plus subscribers, so do feel free to reach out to me at josh@psychedelicalpha.com with any questions or comments. Thanks again.